And I've decided I'm not going to repeat every time, or even every other time, or every third time, um, the certain first principles that we are operating on in terms of establishing or defending the proposition that Paul is a false apostle. I'm just going to go right into the next, each video is just going to go right into the material, the new material. So that's what makes it incumbent upon the listener or the viewer, if you really want to know why we understand Paul to be a false apostle, it would behoove you to go back and listen to the first couple videos in the series, which sums up very well the reason for that. We're entering into chapter 4, and I'm not going through the whole chapter. In fact, I'm only going to do a small section of it. And he hits on something here that I actually missed when I was going through my own research on Paul. And it really does shed quite a lot of light on Paul's frame of mind and Paul's, his state of mind and his attitude and his agenda. We've noted a couple of times that Paul refers to his teaching, which he claims he was getting directly from Jesus, in the form of vocal revelation as well as visions. He refers to it as my gospel in Romans 2:16, if you want to know where that is. My gospel. He does not look to the 12 apostles for any sort of authority or any sort of assistance to understand or to articulate and elaborate for his followers the truth as he sees it. We have come upon numerous instances where Paul's teaching deviated from the teaching of the 12 apostles, and in particular James, who led the group after Jesus' death. And now we're going to see more evidence of that here. So one of the things, what he points out here is that when Paul immediately left for Arabia after his so-called conversion on the road to Damascus, without going to the apostles first, he just sprints for Damascus, starts his movement, starts his ministry. When he goes there, it is no coincidence that he chooses that particular area. He is trying to establish himself in the minds of Jews as another Moses or Elijah. So he retraces, in a sense, the geographical journeyings of Moses and Elijah. And then he decides to embody that very thing. Moses and Elijah were considered the two greatest prophets in all of Jewish history. So he wants to embody this archetype. That's why he goes to Arabia. So the author quotes Galatians 1:15 through 17. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, that's another claim he makes, that God set him apart before he was born, kind of to emphasize his uniqueness among all the apostles, and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia. So he admits it himself. I don't bother conferring with flesh and blood, even if they happen to be the apostles themselves, who were taught directly by Jesus when he was in the flesh. Elsewhere in Galatians, he says he doesn't need to because he gets direct revelation from Jesus. So this isn't just a one-time occurrence. Paul isn't saying that this just happened on the road to Damascus when he was converted. This is an ongoing thing. He has a special relationship with the Lord, who is in heaven seated at the right hand of the Father. He has a direct channel to him and doesn't need to bother with James or the 12. So now let's get into the meat of this. Arabia, as Paul uses the term here, refers to the desert area south of the land of Israel, where Mount Sinai was located. Galatians 4:25. This rather extraordinary decision of Paul to go to Arabia is not mentioned at all in the book of Acts, where Paul heads up to Jerusalem right after his Damascus Road revelation and even meets the apostles, something Paul swears was absolutely not the case. Acts 9:26 through 28. Either the author of Acts knows nothing about the Arabian sojourn, or he is so keen to have Paul linked with the Jerusalem apostles that he purposely ignores it. So why did Paul go to Saudi Arabia? Why did Paul go to Arabia? Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, is called the mountain of God in the Torah. It was the sacred place, the holy ground where God first spoke to Moses in a burning bush, giving him his critical mission to gather the people of Israel and bring them into the promised land. It was also on this mountain, over a 40-day period, that God delivered to Moses the revelation of the Torah. When Moses came down from the mountain, the skin of his face was glowing because he had been talking directly with God, etc. As a result of this revelation, Moses made a covenant between God and the people of Israel. The covenant and the giving of the Torah became the foundational pillars of Judaism, as Paul points out, Romans 9:4. Mount Sinai was also the place to which the prophet Elijah retreated, and it was there in a cave in the same mountain that he had his own extraordinary encounter with God, speaking with him face to face and also witnessing God's glory. See 1 Kings 19:1 through 18. It was neither accident nor arbitrary choice that drove Paul into the Arabian desert immediately after he received his initial vision of Christ. Paul traveled to that desolate area not to confer with any human being, but to hear directly from Jesus Christ. Quote, "For I would have you know, brethren, the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Galatians 1:12. Now, before I read on, please stop there and think about that statement from Paul in Galatians 1:12. This alone should show how utterly disconnected he was from any tradition that preceded him among the 12 apostles. He's boasting in this. He's boasting that he did not receive, that the gospel that he preached was not received from a man. In other words, he's boasting that he did not receive this gospel from any of the 12 apostles, and that he got it directly from Jesus by revelation. So we're not exaggerating when we emphasize the problem with Paul's use of the phrase "my gospel" in Romans 2:16. This is based on his boast that his gospel has nothing to do. It's based on his boast in Galatians 1:12 that his gospel has nothing to do with any man's gospel, but a heavenly gospel. Paul doesn't say how long he stayed in Arabia, but he does note that it was 3 years after his vision of Christ when he finally went up to Jerusalem to meet Peter and James, Galatians 1:18. That visit appears to have been a clandestine one, in that he swears he did not meet any of the other apostles, only these two leaders. One must assume he wanted to convey to them his own experience of seeing Christ and to gain, if possible, some measure of acceptance from them. And by the way, I want to add another note here, my own note. This is why it is reasonable to conclude that the inclusion of the book of James in the New Testament was meant, it wasn't something that the Paulists somehow overlooked. It was included on purpose. It was meant to make it appear as though Paul's gospel flowed naturally from what the community in Jerusalem and the 12 apostles already taught. They wanted to show a kind of unanimity between Paul and the other apostles, because you have to have, in order to buttress his legitimacy, in order for Paul to do that, you can't just assert your uniqueness as, because he's piggybacking on the 12 apostles, because of his whole gospel concerns content related specifically to Jesus, and he wasn't one of Jesus' 12 apostles, so he has to in some way seek some sort of approval. That's one way the Paulists did that, was to include James' letter in the New Testament canon, to make it appear as though whatever tensions may or may not have existed early on with Paul and James, like you see in the book of Acts, it really wasn't a big deal. It gets papered over, and the reader is to assume that everything was resolved at some point in the future. It is certainly not far-fetched to imagine that Paul spent his time in Arabia in isolation, perhaps at one of the mountains that he identified as Sinai, praying, meditating, and trying to sort through his dramatic experiences. Like the 12, he had his own 3 years, quote unquote, with Jesus, but now as the glorified heavenly Christ. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions an ecstatic experience. Again, let me take a minute to just say here, this also explains Paul's theology has to be understood through this filter, okay? He's saying that the reason his gospel supersedes anything that he could have received from the 12 is because he's getting it not just because he's getting it from Jesus directly, because how would that make it any different from the teaching that the 12 apostles received? They received it directly from Jesus too. Paul is implying that his gospel supersedes anything that came before him because it comes from Jesus in his sort of heavenly aspect as opposed to his earthly aspect. It's a very strange thing. But anyway, he says, the author goes on and says, in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions an ecstatic experience that he had 14 years before, in which he was taken up into the heavenly realms and even entered paradise, seeing and hearing things that were so extraordinary he was not permitted to reveal them. He uses the third person for irony's sake, but in the context, he is obviously talking about himself. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows, and I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. The idea of ascending to the third or highest level of heaven and gazing upon the glory of God was viewed within the mystical Jewish circles of Paul's day as the highest and most extraordinary experience a human being could have. Moses alone had been allowed to ascend Mount Sinai and communicate directly with God, and Elijah had been taken up to heaven in a fiery heavenly chariot. So here again we're seeing Paul attempting to connect himself in the minds of the Corinthians with the figures of Elijah and Moses. So this passage here in 2 Corinthians 12 has to be understood in light of his journey early on to Arabia after his so-called conversion. He was literally retracing Moses and Elijah's steps. He wants to make a connection in the minds of the Corinthians between himself and Mount Sinai, where Moses saw the glory of God and received revelation from God. In the 2 centuries before Paul's time, texts like the similitudes of Enoch, and the ascension of Isaiah, in which Enoch and Isaiah ascend to the highest heaven, gaze upon God's throne and experience a transformed glorification, were widely circulated. We don't know the precise year Paul writes this report, but it falls into the general range of his time in Arabia. One should not imagine Paul's conversion as necessarily a sudden one-time event on a single day, as reported in the book of Acts. What he calls his revelation of Jesus Christ was something he was, quote, taught, which implies a period of heavenly tutoring that would have involved multiple visions, quote, visions and revelations of the Lord. That's a quote from Paul in Galatians 1:12 and 2 Corinthians 12:1. This particular ascent experience was one of many visions and revelations he had received, and his experiences were so extraordinary that there was some danger that he would fall victim to pride, knowing that he, among all human beings, had been allowed to see and hear such forbidden mysteries. Consequently, Christ allowed a messenger, Greek angelos, of Satan to harass Paul with some kind of physical affliction he describes, and I'm going to skip over that. So I'm going to skip down to this area here. We're almost done. What makes it all the more likely that Paul's choice of going away into Arabia had to do with Moses and Elijah is that he discusses the Mount Sinai revelations of both of them in his letters. 2 Corinthians 3:4 through 11 and Romans 11:2 through 5. These are not passing references that merely indicate Paul's familiarity with biblical narratives. He draws specific parallels between the message and mission that he received by revelation from Christ and the roles of Moses and Elijah in their own times. Pairing these two particular figures is not accidental. They were considered the two greatest prophets of Israel's past, and the work of each was to be repeated in some fashion in the last days. There are prophecies in the Hebrew Bible about a prophet like Moses appearing once again, as well as a second Elijah who would restore the people of Israel just before the final day of judgment. Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18, and Malachi 4:5 through 6. Various Jewish apocalyptic groups in the time of Jesus expected both Moses and Elijah-like figures to manifest themselves in the last days. The Gospel of Mark reports an extraordinary experience in the life of Jesus when he and the three of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, are on a high mountain. He's talking about the transfiguration here, where supposedly Moses and Elijah appeared. By tracing the journeys of Moses and Elijah to the Arabian area of the Sinai desert, quite literally, Paul was paralleling his own extraordinary revelations with those of the two greatest Hebrew prophets. He is quite specific about this point. So Paul sees himself as the administrator of God's new covenant with a new spiritual Israel. In view of the new, all that was old was now fading and passing away. Paul refers to the covenant that Moses brought as the dispensation of death, contrasting it to the new covenant that he calls the dispensation of the Spirit. Okay, so I think you get, we don't need to go any further. I just wanted to bring that out, that parallel between the journeys of Moses and Elijah and Paul's choice to go to Arabia. He's literally trying to build himself up in the minds of his communities as something more than he is, and he's also trying to pass himself off as superior to the 12 apostles. He's trying to pass his ministry off as something unique and special. All right, we're at the 20-minute mark and going, so let's end it now, and I'll pick it up again in another video.